I think maybe one of the things I'll just tell you is the audience for this is a strange conglomeration of people who like classical music, but it's not just the classical people. It's sometimes maybe the people like me who, when they heard this old music, it was new for them. So you get a certain crowd. It's a small but loyal crowd in the States. It's much bigger in Europe. There are nationalistic reasons. The early music scene in Europe tended to go very much by country. The Dutch were interested in Baroque music because it related to the Dutch Republic, the great era. The French were interested in French Baroque music. The Belgians were interested in polyphonic music because 15th and 16th century was the time where the great musicians were trained in the area of Belgium. Italians were interested in Palestrina and Monteverdi. So you have these really strong people focusing on that music, and it's part of the whole culture in classical music in Europe. Ours tends to be a little more of a niche market, but there's also a lot of interest when I pick up one of these. If somebody comes to a concert who's a folk fan, they get interested in it. People who like early music also tend to like Celtic music. People who like opera often like early opera, but there tends to also be a divide. People who like, opera, verismo and some bel canto, as opposed to people who like early opera, etc. There's also a kind of funny thing that happens on the East Coast and West Coast. They're different countries because it takes as long to fly from here to New York as it does to anywhere. But having said that, a lot of people travel back and forth to the coasts, and there's some middle country work, but people tend to get little communities in small towns and then bring people in for other things. But the West Coast and East Coast have something similar, is that they have these trains of cities that do things. And I always laugh because Boston has a really special quality of being an early music city. And everybody thinks Boston is a much more early music city because there are more renowned things happening there than there are in New York. But there's actually a lot more work in New York if you're in the business. There are a lot more circles of people doing it in all kinds of ways you can make a living. And the Bay Area has a much more strong reputation for being an early music center than Los Angeles. And yet, oddly enough, there's also quite a lot of ways to make a living and work here, and they're not always the ways you think. So yes, you are more likely to say, I need to show them for a movie, and have that kind of business aspect of music down here as opposed to the early music scene. Mm-hmm. Both New York and Los Angeles also have that problem of being a little less centralized. There's a lot of things going on. So what is the downside is also an opportunity. There's so many more places for you to do things. So.